Srila Prabhupada Lilamrta, Volume 3. Only He Could Lead Them. San Francisco/India, 1967. A biography of His Divine Grace, A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada, founder Acharya of the International Society for Krishna Consciousness, by Sattvarup Das Goswami. Chapter 1, Swami Invites the Hippies. And I'll be reading the second half of this chapter. Bonnie McDonald, age 19, and her boyfriend Gary McElroy, 20, had both come to San Francisco from Austin, where they had been living together as students at the University of Texas. Bonnie was a slight, fair blonde with a sweet southern drawl. She was born and raised in southeast Texas in a Baptist family. In high school, she had become agnostic, but later, while traveling in Europe and studying the religious art there and the architecture of the great cathedrals, she had concluded that these great artists couldn't have been completely wrong. Gary, the son of a U.S. Air Force officer, had been raised in Germany, Okinawa, and other places around the world before his family had settled in Texas. His dark hair and bushy brows gave him a scowling look, except when he smiled. He was one of the first students at the University of Texas to wear long hair and experiment with psychedelic drugs. While taking LSD together, he and Bonnie had become obsessed with the idea of going on a spiritual search, and without notifying their parents or school, they had driven to the West Coast in search of someone who could teach us about spiritual life. They had spent a few frustrating months searching through spiritual books and amongst spiritual groups in Haight-Ashbury. They had become vegetarians. Gary had started teaching himself to play electric guitar, while Bonnie had gone to Golden Gate Park every day to perform a self-styled Hatha Yoga meditation. But gradually they had become disillusioned and had felt themselves becoming degraded from drugs. When the disciple is ready, the guru will appear, they had read, and they had waited eagerly for the day when their guru would come. Although Bonnie had spent most of her time in the parks of San Francisco, one day she had been looking through a table full of magazines in a Haight-Ashbury head shop when she had found a copy of Back to Godhead, the mimeographed journal produced by Srila Prabhupada's disciples in New York. She had been particularly attracted to Hayagriva's article about Swamiji. The descriptions of Swamiji's smile, his bright eyes, his pointy-toed shoes, and the things he said had given her a feeling that this might be the guru she had been looking for. And when she had learned that this same Swamiji had opened an ashram in Haight-Ashbury, she had immediately started searching through the neighborhood until she found the temple on Frederick Street. Before Bonnie and Gary met Swamiji, they had both been troubled. Gary was in anxiety about the threat of being drafted into the army, and both of them were disillusioned because they had not found the truth they had come to San Francisco to find. So, on meeting Srila Prabhupada in his room, they began to explain their situation. Bonnie. He was sitting in a rocking chair in his little apartment, and he looked at us like we were crazy, because we were, and said, "You come to my classes. Simply come to my classes every morning and every evening, and everything will be all right." That sounded to us like an unbelievable panacea, but because we were so bewildered, we agreed to it. I told him I had traveled all over Europe, and he said, "Oh, you have traveled so much." And I said to him, "Yes, I have traveled so much. I have done so many things, but none of it ever made me happy." He was pleased with that statement. He said, "Yes, that is the problem." We began going to his morning lectures. For us, it was a long distance to get there at 7 a.m, but we did it every morning with the conviction that this was what he had said to do, and we were going to do it. Then one day he asked us, "What do you do?" When we said that formerly we had been art students at college, he told us to paint pictures of Krishna. Shortly after that, we asked to be initiated. Jonah and Roger were soon initiated, receiving the names Jamuna and Gurudas. And the very next day, they were married. At their wedding ceremony, Swamiji presided, wearing a bulky garland of leaves and rhododendron flowers. He sat on a cushion on the temple floor, surrounded by his followers and paraphernalia for the sacrificial fire. Before him was the small mound of earth where he would later build the fire. He explained the meaning of Krishna-conscious marriage and how husband and wife should assist one another and serve Krishna, keeping him in the center. Swamiji had commented that he did not like the Western women's dress, and at his request, Jamuna was dressed in a sari. Although Swamiji had called for ghee, clarified butter, as one of the sacrificial ingredients, the devotees, thinking ghee too costly, had substituted melted margarine. He had called for firewood also, and the devotees had supplied him the bits of a broken orange crate. Now, with Jamuna and Guru Das seated before him on the opposite side of the mound of earth, he picked up a small piece of the splintered orange crate, dipped it into what he supposed to be ghee, and held it in the candle flame to begin the fire. The splinter flamed, sputtered, and went out. He picked up another splinter and moistened it in the melted margarine, but when he touched it to the flame, it made the same sound and sputtered out. After trying unsuccessfully 4 or 5 times, Swamiji looked up and said, "This marriage will have a very slow start." Jamuna began to cry. Bonnie and Gary were initiated just 2 weeks after they had met Swamiji. Bonnie's initiated name was Govinda Dasi, and Gary's was Gaurasundar. Although still dressed in blue jeans even at their initiation, and not professing to know much of what was going on, they had confidence in Swamiji. They knew that their minds were still hazy from drugs, but they took their initiation seriously and became strict followers. Gaurasundar threw out whatever marijuana he had, and he and Govinda Dasi began eating only food they had offered to Lord Krishna. 2 weeks after their initiation, Swamiji conducted their marriage ceremony. On the evening of the wedding, Govinda Dasi's father came from Texas, even though he objected to Krishna consciousness as radically un-American. Walking up to Srila Prabhupada's seat in the temple, Govinda Dasi's father asked, "Why do you have to change my daughter's name? Why does she have to have an Indian name?" Prabhupada looked at him, and then, with a mischievous gleam, looked at Mr. Patel, an Indian guest, standing nearby with his family. "You don't like Indians?" he asked. Everyone who heard Swamiji laughed, except for Govinda Dasi's father, who replied, "Well, yeah, they're all right, but why does Bonnie have to have a different name?" "Because she has asked me to give her one," Srila Prabhupada replied. If you love her, you will like what she likes. Your daughter is happy. Why do you object?" The discussion ended there, and Govinda Dasi's father remained civil. Later he enjoyed taking prasadam with his daughter and son-in-law. Govinda Dasi. Gaurasundar and I set about reading the 3 volumes of Swamiji's Srimad Bhagavatam. And at the same time, Swamiji had told me to paint a large canvas of Radha and Krishna and a cow. So every day, for the whole day, I would paint, and Gaurasundar would read out loud from the Srimad Bhagavatam, 1 volume after another. We did this continuously for 2 months. During this time, Swamiji also asked me to do a portrait of him standing before a background painting of Lord Chaitanya dancing. Swamiji wanted it so that Lord Chaitanya's foot would be touching his head. I tried. It was a pretty horrible painting, and yet he was happy with it. Prabhupada's thoughtful followers felt that some of the candidates for initiation did not intend to fulfill the exclusive lifelong commitment a disciple owes to his guru. Swamiji, they would say, "Some of these people come only for their initiation. We've never seen them before, and we never see them again." Srila Prabhupada replied that that was the risk he had to take. One day, in a lecture in the temple, he explained that although the reactions for a disciple's past sins are removed at initiation, the spiritual master remains responsible until the disciple is delivered from the material world. Therefore, he said, Lord Chaitanya warned that a guru should not accept many disciples. One night in the temple during the question and answer session, a big bearded fellow raised his hand and asked Prabhupada, "Can I become initiated?" The brash public request annoyed some of Prabhupada's followers, but Prabhupada was serene. "Yes," he replied, "but first you must answer 2 questions. Who is Krishna?" The boy thought for a moment and said, "Krishna is God." "Yes," Prabhupada replied. "And who are you?" Again the boy thought for a few moments and then replied, "I am the servant of God." "Very good," Prabhupada said. "Yes, you can be initiated tomorrow." Srila Prabhupada knew that it would be difficult for his Western disciples to stick to Krishna consciousness and attain the goal of pure devotional service. All their lives they had had the worst of training, and despite their nominal Christianity and philosophical searching, most of them knew nothing of the science of God. They did not even know that illicit sex and meat eating were wrong, although when he told them, they accepted what he said. And they freely chanted Hare Krishna, so how could he refuse them? Of course, whether they would be able to persevere in Krishna consciousness despite the ever-present attractions of Maya would be seen in time. Some would fall. That was the human tendency. But some would not. At least those who sincerely followed his instructions to chant Hare Krishna and avoid sinful activities would be successful. He gave the example that a person could say that today's fresh food, if not properly used, would spoil in a few days. But if it is fresh now, to say that in the future it will be misused and therefore spoil is only a surmise. Yes, in the future anyone could fall down, but Prabhupada took it as his responsibility to engage his disciples now. And he was giving them the methods which, if followed, would protect them from ever falling down. Aside from Vedic standards, even by the standard of Swamiji's New York disciples, the devotees in San Francisco were not very strict. Some continued going to the donut shop, eating food without offering it to Krishna, and eating forbidden things like chocolate and commercial ice cream. Some even indulged in after kirtan cigarette breaks right outside the temple door. Some got initiated without knowing precisely what they had agreed to practice. Kirtanananda. The mood in San Francisco was a lot more relaxed. The devotees liked to go to the corner and have their coffee and donuts, but Prabhupada loved the way so many people were coming, and he loved the program at the Avalon Ballroom. But there were 2 sides, those who strictly followed the rules and regulations and emphasized purity, and then those who were not so concerned about strictness, but who wanted to spread Krishna consciousness as widely as possible. Swamiji was so great that he embraced both groups. Michael Wright, 21, had recently gotten out of the Marine Corps, and Nancy Grindle, 18, was fresh out of high school. They had met in college in Los Angeles. Feeling frustrated and in need of something tangible to which to dedicate their lives, they had come to San Francisco to join the Hippies. But they soon realized that they and the Haight-Ashbury hippies, whom they found dirty, aimless, unproductive, and lost in their search for identity, had little in common. So, Nancy took a job as a secretary for the telephone company, and Michael found work as a lineman for the electric company. Then they heard about the Swami in Haight-Ashbury and decided to visit the temple. It was an evening kirtan, and the irrepressible hippies were twirling, twisting, and wiggling. Michael and Nancy took a seat on the floor off to one side, impressed more by the presence of the Swami than by the kirtan. After the kirtan, Prabhupada lectured, but they found his accent heavy. They wanted to understand. They had an innate feeling that he was saying something valuable, and yet the secrets seemed locked behind a thick accent and within a book written in another language. they decided to come back in the morning and try again. At the morning program, they found a smaller group, a dozen devotees with beads for chanting draped around their necks, a few street people. The kirtan seemed sweeter and more mellow, and Michael and Nancy chanted and danced along with the devotees. Then Prabhupada spoke, and this time they caught a few of his ideas. They stayed for breakfast and became friends with Mukunda and Janaki, Sam and Marjorie, now Shyamasundar and Malati, Jamuna and Guru Das, and Govinda Dasi and Gaurasundar. They liked the devotees and promised to come again that evening. Soon they were regularly attending the morning and evening programs, and Nancy, along with the other women, was attending Prabhupada's weekend cooking classes. Michael was open to Prabhupada's ideas, but he had difficulty accepting the necessity of surrendering to a spiritual authority. His tendency was to reject authorities. But the more he thought about it, the more he saw that Prabhupada was right. He had to accept an authority. He reasoned, "Every time I stop at a red light, I'm accepting an authority." And finally he concluded that to progress in spiritual understanding, he would have to accept a spiritual authority. Yet, because he didn't want to accept it, he was in a dilemma. Finally, after hearing Prabhupada's lectures for 2 weeks, Michael decided to surrender to Prabhupada's authority and try to become Krishna conscious. Michael. Nancy and I decided to get married and become Swamiji's disciples and members of his society. We told some of the devotees we would like to see Swamiji. They said, "Yes, just go up. He's on the 3rd floor." We were a little surprised that there were no formalities required, and when we got to the door, his servant Ranachora let us in. We went in with our shoes on, so Ranachora had to ask us to take them off. I didn't know exactly what to say to Swamiji. I was depending on my future wife to make the initial opening, but then I finally said, "We came because we would like to become members of your Krishna conscious society." He said this was very nice. Then I said that actually the main reason we were there was that we wanted to be married. We knew that he performed marriage ceremonies and that it was part of the society's requirements that couples had to be duly married before they could live together. Swamiji asked me if I liked the philosophy and if I had a job. My answer to both questions was yes. He explained that, first of all, we would have to be initiated, and then we could be married the next month. At their initiation, Michael received the name Dayananda, and Nancy received the name Nandarani. Soon, Prabhupada performed their marriage. Nandarani. We knew it would be a very big wedding. In Haight-Ashbury, whenever Swamiji would perform a wedding, hundreds of people would come, and the temple would be filled. My parents were coming, and Dayananda's parents were also coming. Swamiji said that it was proper that I cook. He said I should come to his apartment on the morning of the wedding, and he would help me cook something for the wedding feast. So that morning I put on my best jeans and my best sweatshirt and my boots, and I went off to Swamiji's apartment. When I got upstairs, I walked in with my boots on. Swamiji was sitting there in his rocking chair. He smiled at me and said, "Oh, you have come to cook." I said, "Yes." He sat there and looked at me, one of those long silent stares. He said, "First take off the boots." After I took off my boots and my old leather jacket, Swamiji got up and went into the kitchen. He got a very large pot that had been burned so thick on the bottom that practically there was no metal visible. He handed it to me and said, "We want to boil milk in this pot. It has to be washed." There wasn't a sink in Swamiji's kitchen, only a teeny round basin. So I went into the bathroom, put the pot in the bathtub, and rinsed it out. I assumed Swamiji didn't want the black off the bottom because it was burned on. So I brought it back to him and he said, "Oh, that is very clean, but just take off this little black on the bottom here." I said, "Okay," and I got a knife and crawled into the bathtub and started scrubbing the black off. I worked and worked and worked, and I scrubbed and scrubbed. I had cleanser up to my elbows, and I made a mess everywhere. I had gotten about half the black off. The rest seemed to be more or less an integral part of the bottom, so I took the pot back to Swamiji and said, "This is the best I can do. All of this is burned on." He said, yes, you've done a wonderful job. Now, just take off this black that's left." So I went into the bathtub and scrubbed and scrubbed and scrubbed. It was almost midday when I came out of the bathtub with all the black scrubbed off the bottom of that pot. He was so happy when I brought the pot in. It was sparkling. A big smile came on his face, and he said, "Oh, this is perfect." I was exhausted. Then Swamiji welcomed me into his kitchen and taught me how to make rasgullas. We boiled the milk, curdled it, and then I sat down and began rolling the curd into balls on a tray. As I rolled the balls, I would put them in a little row along the tray, and every single ball had to be exactly the same size. Swamiji would take his thumb and first and second fingers and shoot the balls out of the row when they weren't the right size. And I would have to remake them until they were the right size. This went on until I had a full tray of balls all the same size. Then Swamiji showed me how to boil the balls of curd in sugar butter. Malati, Janaki, and I were cooking in the kitchen, and Swamiji was singing. At one point, Swamiji stopped singing and asked me, "Do you know what your name means?" I couldn't even remember what my name was. He had told me at initiation, but because none of us used our devotee names, I couldn't remember what mine was. I said, "No, Swamiji, what does my name mean?" He said, "It means you are the mother of Krishna." And he laughed loudly and went back to stirring the rasgullas. I couldn't understand who Krishna was, who in the world his mother would be, or how I was in any way related to her. But I was satisfied that Swamiji felt that I was somebody worth being. I finished cooking that afternoon about 4 o'clock, and then I went home to get dressed for the wedding. Although I had never worn anything but old dresses and jeans, Swamiji has suggested to the other ladies that they find a way to put me into a sari for the wedding. So we bought a piece of silk to use for a sari. I went to Malati's house. She was going to try to help me put it on. I couldn't keep it on, so she had to sew it on me. Then they decorated me with flowers and took me to Swamiji and showed him. He was very happy. He said, "This is the way our women should always look. No more jeans and dresses. They should always wear saris." Actually, I looked a fright. I kept stumbling, and they had to sew the cloth on me, but Swamiji thought it was wonderful. The cloth was all one color, so Swamiji said, "Next time you should buy cloth that has a little border on the bottom, so it is two colors. I like two colors better." When he went downstairs to the wedding, Swamiji met my relatives. He spoke to them very politely. My mother cried a lot during the ceremony. I was very satisfied that she had been blessed by meeting Swamiji. Steve Bollert, age 20, born and raised in New York, and now living the hippie life in San Francisco, had read in The Oracle about Swami Bhaktivedanta coming to San Francisco. The idea of meeting an Indian Swami had interested him, and responding to a notice he had seen posted on Haight Street, he had gone along with Carolyn Gold, the woman he was living with, to the airport to meet Swami Bhaktivedanta. He and Carolyn had both gotten a blissful lift by chanting Hare Krishna and seeing Prabhupada, and they began regularly attending the lectures and kirtans at the temple. Steve decided he wanted to become like the Swami, so he and Carolyn went together to see Prabhupada and request initiation. Speaking privately with Prabhupada in his room, they discussed obedience to the spiritual master and becoming vegetarian. When Prabhupada told them that they should either stop living together or get married, they said they would like to get married. An initiation date was set. Prabhupada asked Steve to shave his long hair and beard. "Why do you want me to shave my head?" Steve protested. Krishna had long hair, Rama had long hair, Lord Chaitanya had long hair, and Christ had long hair. Why should I shave my head? Prabhupada smiled and replied, because now you are following me. There was a print on the wall of Suradas, a Vaishnava. You should shave your head like that, Prabhupada said, pointing to Suradas. I don't think I'm ready to do that yet, Steve said. All right, you are still a young man. There's still time. But at least you should shave your face, clean and cut your hair like a man. On the morning of the initiation, Steve shaved off his beard and cut his hair around his ears so that it was short in front, but long in the back. How's this? He asked. You should cut the back also, Prabhupada replied. Steve agreed. To Steve, Prabhupada gave the name Subal, or Subala, and to Carolyn the name Krishna Devi. A few days later, he performed their wedding. Subala, maybe. Since each ceremony was another occasion for kirtan and prasadam distribution, onlookers became attracted. And as the spiritual names and married couples increased with each ceremony, Prabhupada's spiritual family grew. The harmonious atmosphere was like that of a small, loving family, and Prabhupada dealt with his disciples intimately, without the formalities of an institution or hierarchy. Disciples would approach him for various reasons, entering the apartment to be alone with him as he sat on a mat before his makeshift desk in the morning sunlight. With men like Mukunda, Gurudas, and Shyamasundar, Swamiji was a friend. With Janaki and Govinda Dasi, he was sometimes ready to be chided, almost like their naughty son, or he would be their grandfatherly teacher of cooking, the enforcer of the rules of kitchen cleanliness. And to all of them he was the unfathomable pure devotee of Lord Krishna, who knew the conclusions of all the Vedic scriptures, and who knew beyond all doubts the truth of transmigration. He could answer all questions. He could lead them beyond material life, beyond haight-ashbury hippiedom, and into the spiritual world of Krishna. It was 7 p.m. Srila Prabhupada entered the temple dressed in a saffron dhoti, an old turtleneck jersey under a cardigan sweater, and a chadar around his shoulders. Walking to the dais in the rear of the room, he took his seat. The dais, a cushion atop a redwood plank 2 feet off the floor, was supported between 2 redwood columns. In front of the dais stood a cloth-covered lectern with a bucket of cut flowers on either side. Covering the wall behind the dais was a typical Indian madras, with Haridas's crude painting of Lord Chaitanya in kirtan hanging against it. Srila Prabhupada picked up his kartals, wrapped the cloth straps around his forefingers, and looked out at his young followers, sitting cross-legged on the burgundy rug. The men were bearded, and almost everyone wore long hair, beads, exotic clothing, and trinkets. The bulbs hanging from the ceiling diffused their light through Japanese paper lanterns, and Navajo God's Eye symbols dangled from strings. Prabhupada began the ringing, 1, 2, 3 rhythm, and Shyamasundar began pumping the harmonium. Although the harmonium was a simple instrument, a miniature piano keyboard to be played with the right hand and a bellows to be pumped with the left hand, no one in the Frederick Street storefront knew how to play it, so it became simply the drone. Another important kirtan instrument, the 2-headed mridanga from India, was meant for intricate rhythmic accompaniments, but even Mukunda could play it only very simply, matching the 1, 2, 3 of Prabhupada's kartals. There were other instruments on hand, the kettle drum, the pride of the temple, Hayagriva's old cornet, a few conch shells, and a horn Hayagriva had made by shellacking a piece of kelp he found on the beach. Some guests had brought their own flutes, pipes, and bongos, but for now they let their instruments remain still and clapped to Prabhupada's rhythm, as he sang the evening prayers. Prabhupada's Sanskrit hymn praised the Vaishnava spiritual masters. For each great devotee in the disciplic succession, he sang a specific prayer. First, he chanted the poetic description of the transcendental qualities of Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati. Then, Gaur Kishore Das Babaji, Bhaktivinoda Thakur, one after another. One prayer described Srila Bhaktisiddhanta as the deliverer of the fallen souls, and another praised Gaur Kishore Das Babaji as renunciation personified, always merged in the feeling of separation and intense love for Krishna. Srila Prabhupada sang of Lord Chaitanya, the golden-complexioned Supreme Personality of Godhead, who distributed pure love of Krishna. And he sang of Lord Krishna, the ocean of mercy, the friend of the distressed, the source of creation. As Prabhupada became absorbed in the bhajan, his body trembled with ecstatic emotion. The group on the floor sat swaying from side to side, watching him, his eyes closed in meditation, his delicate practiced fingers expertly playing the cymbals. They heard the heartfelt minor moods and tones of his voice, unlike anything they had heard before. Then he began the familiar mantra they had come to hear. Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, and immediately they joined him. The horns and drums sounded, and soon all the other instrument players joined in. Gradually, a few at a time, members of the audience rose to their feet and began to dance. Prabhupada's followers stood and began stepping from side to side as he had shown them, sometimes raising their hands in the air. Others moved as they pleased. Occasionally opening his eyes and glancing around, Prabhupada sat firmly chanting, though his head and body were trembling. After 20 minutes, many of the young dancers were leaping, jumping, and perspiring, as Prabhupada continued to sing, leading the dancers by the beat of his kartals. His eyes were closed, yet he controlled the entire wild congregation, playing his kartals loudly. The chanting and dancing continued, and Prabhupada approved. The kirtan of these hippies was different from the chanting of Indian brahmanas, but Prabhupada didn't mind. His standard was devotion. In his Radha Krishna temple, whatever he accepted, Krishna accepted. This was his offering to Krishna through his spiritual master Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati. Prabhupada was absolutely confident. Even if his young devotees didn't know how to play the harmonium keyboard or the mridanga, even if they didn't know that congregational kirtan should be done not in constant unison as they were doing, but responsively, and even if they didn't know how to honor the Guru, still, because they were chanting and dancing, he encouraged them and nodded to them, yes. Wild elements were there, of course, people whose minds and intentions were far away in some chemically induced fantasy. Yet, the mood was dominated by Srila Prabhupada's followers, who danced with arms upraised and watched their leader carefully. Although in many ways they were still like hippies, they were Swamiji's disciples, and they wanted to please him and follow his instructions. They wanted to attain Krishna consciousness. For all the varied punctuation of horns and timpani, the kirtan remained sweet. Hayagriva even played his cornet in tune, and only during every other mantra. Srila Prabhupada knew that some aspects of the kirtan were wrong or below standard, but he accepted the offering, and not awkwardly, but lovingly. He simply wanted these American boys and girls to chant. That they dressed irregularly, jumped too savagely, or had the wrong philosophy did not over-concern him. These boys and girls were chanting Hare Krishna, so, at least for the present, they were pure. The hippies knew that too, and they loved it. Just as in Janaki's dream, Srila Prabhupada's pleasure was to see the whole world engaged in kirtan. Somehow or other, he would say, people should be engaged in Krishna consciousness. And this was the instruction of Lord Chaitanya's chief follower, Rupa Goswami, who had written, Tasmat kenapyu payana manaha krishne niveshayet. Somehow or other, fix the mind on Krishna. The rules and regulations can come later. Inherent in this attitude of Srila Prabhupada's and Srila Rupa Goswami's was a strong conviction about the purifying force of the holy name. If engaged in chanting Hare Krishna, even the most fallen person could gradually become a saintly devotee. Srila Prabhupada would often quote a verse from Srimad Bhagavatam affirming that persons addicted to sinful acts could be purified by taking shelter of the devotees of the Lord. He knew that every Haight-Ashbury hippie was eligible to receive the mercy of the holy name, and he saw it as his duty to his spiritual master to distribute the gift of Krishna consciousness freely, rejecting no one. Yet, while living amongst these mlechas, he required a certain standard of behavior, and he was adamant about preserving the purity of his Krishna consciousness society. For example, if he were going to distribute free food to the public, it could not be ordinary food, but must be prasadam, food offered to Krishna. Feeding hungry people was futile unless they were given prasadam and the chance of liberation from birth and death. And although in the kirtans he allowed openness and free expression and welcomed the wildest participation, the transcendental sound of the holy name had to dominate. He never allowed the kirtan to degenerate into mere beating on drums or chanting of any old words. Nor could anyone in the group become so crazy that others wouldn't be able to hear or take part in congregational chanting. In his attempts to, somehow or other, get these young people chanting Hare Krishna, Prabhupada instinctively knew what to allow and what not to allow. He was the master, and his new disciples followed him when he permitted an egoistic sensual dancer to jump around the temple or a drugged madman to argue with him in a question and answer period. When a person was too disruptive, Prabhupada was not afraid to stop him, but stopping was rare. The main thing was giving. The kirtan lasted more than an hour as the chanters joined hands and danced around the room, and incense poured out the front door. The morning and evening kirtans had already made the Radha Krishna temple popular in Haight-Ashbury. But when the devotees began serving a daily free lunch, the temple became an integral part of the community. Prabhupada told his disciples simply to cook and distribute prasadam. That would be their only activity during the day. In the morning they would cook, and at noon they would feed everyone who came, sometimes 150 to 200 hippies from the streets of Haight-Ashbury. Before the morning kirtan, the girls would put oatmeal on the stove, and by breakfast there would be a room full of hippies, most of whom had been up all night. The cereal and fruit was for some the first solid food in days. But the main program was the lunch. Malati would go out and shop, getting donations whenever possible for whole wheat flour, garbanzo flour, split peas, rice, and whatever vegetables were cheap or free. Potatoes, carrots, turnips, rutabagas, beets. Then every day the cooks would prepare spiced mashed potatoes, buttered chapatis, split pea dal, and a vegetable dish for 200 people. The lunch program was possible because many merchants were willing to donate to the recognized cause of feeding hippies. Harsharani. The lunch program attracted a lot of the hippie hill crowd, who obviously wanted food. They were really hungry. And there were other people who would come also, people who were working with the temple but weren't initiated. The record player would be playing the Swamiji's record. It was a nice family atmosphere. Haridas. It was taken outside too, outside the front, but the main food was served inside. It was amazing. The people would just all huddle together and we would really line them wall to wall. A lot of them would simply eat and leave. Other stores along Haight-Ashbury were selling everything from beads to rock records, but our store was different because we weren't selling anything. we were giving it away. And we were welcoming everybody. We were providing a kind of refugee, or refuge, perhaps, from the tumult and madness of the scene. So it was in that sense a hospital, and I think a lot of people were helped and maybe even saved. I don't mean only their souls. I mean their minds and bodies were saved because of what was going on in the streets that they just simply couldn't handle. I'm talking about overdoses of drugs, people who were plain lost and needed comforting, and who sort of wandered or staggered into the temple. Some of them stayed and became devotees, and some just took prasadam and left. Daily we had unusual incidents, and Swamiji witnessed it and took part in it. The lunch program was his idea. Mukunda. The Salvation Army came in one day for lunch. They just unloaded a whole truckload of people on us, about 30 or 40. Larry Shippen. Some of the community of loose people cynically took advantage of the free food. They didn't appreciate the Swami because they said he was, in his own way, an orthodox minister, and they were much more interested in being unorthodox. It was a fairly cynical thing. Those who were more interested and had questions, the spiritual seekers, would visit Swamiji in his room. Many of them would come in complete anxiety over the war in Vietnam or whatever was going on, trouble with the law, bad experiences on drugs, a falling out with school or family. There was much public concern about the huge influx of youth into San Francisco, a situation that was creating an almost uncontrollable social problem. Police and social welfare workers were worried about health problems and poor living conditions, especially in Haight-Ashbury. Some middle-class people feared a complete hippie takeover. The local authorities welcomed the service offered by Swami Bhaktivedanta's temple, and when civic leaders in Haight-Ashbury talked of forming a council to deal with the crisis, they requested Swami Bhaktivedanta to take part. He agreed, but lost interest after the first meeting. No one seemed seriously interested in hearing his solution. Master Subramunia. A lot of responsible citizens in San Francisco were very happy that Swami Bhaktivedanta was working amongst the young people. The young people at that time were searching and needed somebody of a very high caliber who would take an interest in them and who would say, "You should do this and you should not do that." The consensus was that no one could tell the young people what to do because they were completely out of hand with drugs and so forth. But Swamiji told them what to do and they did it, and everyone was appreciative, especially the young people. Harsharani. Just from a medical standpoint, doctors didn't know what to do with people on LSD. The police and the free clinics in the area couldn't handle the overload of people taking LSD. The police saw Swamiji as a certain refugee. And again, I think they mean refuge. Michael Bowen. Bhaktivedanta had an amazing ability through devotion to get people off drugs, especially speed, heroin, burnt-out LSD cases, all of that. Haridas. The police used to come with their paddy wagons through the park in the early hours of the morning and pick up runaway teenagers sleeping in the park. The police would round them up and try to send them back home. The hippies needed all the help they could get, and they knew it. And the Radha Krishna temple was certainly a kind of spiritual haven. Kids sensed it. They were running, living on the streets, no place where they could go, where they could rest, where people weren't going to hurt them. A lot of kids would literally fall into the temple. I think it saved a lot of lives. There might have been a lot more casualties if it hadn't been for Hare Krishna. It was like opening a temple in a battlefield. It was the hardest place to do it, but it was the place where it was most needed. Although the Swami had no precedence for dealing with any of this, He applied the chanting with miraculous results. The chanting was wonderful. It worked. Srila Prabhupada knew that only Krishna consciousness could help. Others had their remedies, but Prabhupada considered them mere patchwork. He knew that ignorantly identifying the self with the body was the real cause of suffering. How could someone help himself, what to speak of others, if he did not know who he was? If he didn't know that the body was only a covering of the real self, the spirit soul, which could be happy only in his original nature as an eternal servant of Krishna. Understanding that Lord Krishna considered anyone who approached him a virtuous person, and that even a little devotional service would never be lost and could save a person at the time of death, Srila Prabhupada had opened his door to everyone, even the most abject runaway. But for a lost soul to fully receive the balm of Krishna consciousness, he would first have to stay a while and chant, inquire, listen,